Hi, this is Melissa Varga. I'm the Science Network Community Manager at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on scientists and the media, op-eds, LTEs, and working with journalists. Today we have presentations from two experts who have spent a lot of time talking with both scientists and journalists, one of them as a journalist herself and the other as a communications officer. Neela Banerjee, a senior correspondent at Inside Climate News, will cover different ways for scientists to work with journalists to get the story out. And Seth, a communications officer for the Union of Concerned Scientists, is going to discuss writing for the media and different ways that you can weigh in. And we should have plenty of time for questions at the end. So send us your questions throughout the presentation through the chat box on the side of the screen, and I will pass those along to the presenters. And as you listen to Neela and Seth, keep in mind the questions that you answered when registering for the webinar. What are some misconceptions that people have about your area of work, and who is a reporter you'd like to connect with? This may help give you some ideas about different avenues that you can pursue after the webinar. So to kick things off, I'd like to start with a poll question. How would you like to engage the media this year? Hopefully you're joining us because you have some ideas about different ways that you want to work with journalists or get your story out there. So feel free to choose different options. You can choose more than one. I'm going to leave this open for a couple more seconds. Go ahead and share your thoughts with us. All right. It looks like lots of you are interested in doing some writing, either writing an opinion piece or a letter to the editor. I'm glad that many of you are interested in building relationships with journalists. That's great to hear. And also interested in providing some background. That's a great way to get more involved. So we have a lot to cover today and probably won't be able to go in depth on all of these different opportunities, but our presenters are going to give a great overview of some of the ways that you can use your expertise to work with the media. And Neela is going to kick it off for us. So take it away, Neela.
Hi, everyone. Well, thank you for inviting me to this. And that poll actually helps me think a lot about the kind of comments that I'd like to make. But as much as you think, as scientists, that you need the media, I can tell you as a reporter who writes about energy and environmental issues that we really need you. We really, really need scientists. And we need scientists who can explain their areas of expertise clearly for the interested lay reader. And the things that I write about are often very controversial. So, for example, there's a slide right now about fracking, right? Fracking is an issue that when I was at the LA Times, that's when this story ran, and now I'm at Inside Climate News. Whenever we had a story about fracking, it was always heavily shared on social media. People really care about this stuff. And it's also something that becomes a real flashpoint of controversy, and there are different interest groups that are trying to get their spin out on what's happening with fracking. Is it safe for water? Is it not? Does it what kind of air pollution and health effects does it contribute to? Does it not contribute to any of that? So, a lot of journalists are caught in the middle, and they're getting bombarded every day with information from either industry or environmental groups or politicians about this. And this is where I, as a journalist, feel that scientists come in. For me to understand what's going on in a phenomenon like hydraulic fracturing, I turn to scientists and I look at peer-reviewed research, and I reach out to the scientists who have who've written these articles and discuss it with them. So let me see if I can. I'm a presenter. I'm not. Here we go. So here's another story that's also about fracking. You're not getting to see the whole story here, but these stories are indicative of a relationship that I have built with a scientist, and maybe if I talk a little bit about how that worked, it might help you. So. These two stories, I'm pretty sure, were based on research done by Rob Jackson, who had done a lot of work on water and fracking out of Duke when he was there, and now he's at Stanford. And what I've appreciated about working with Rob is that he takes the time to explain things clearly to me, and his articles themselves are very well written and clearly written. And so that is, I think perhaps that's the first thing. It's for you as scientists to understand is that, a lot of us who cover the sciences as journalists we're not science majors at university. I went to Yale, but I was an English major. Other people do have environmental science backgrounds. But the good thing is that if you're talking to an environmental or any other science reporter, the reason we're in these beats, by and large, is because we want to learn. And I've been very lucky that in more than 10 years of doing this, that almost every scientist I've spoken to has been delighted to teach me. I think I could count on one hand the few scientists I felt were condescending or rude or unpleasant. So that's the first thing. So please be aware of that our backgrounds are different from yours, but we bring certain strengths. And who we are we are the messengers of your information to the lay audience. So what I've found very useful when I've spoken to scientists, including Rob and others too, but Rob is somebody I deal with a lot, is that first of all, they never make me feel like I'm asking a dumb question. I also preface a lot of things by saying, this is going to be a dumb question, or feel free to condescend to me. And they, at the same time, the good scientists that I speak to will also say, let me know if you already know this. I don't want to condescend to you. So it's already a relationship of each person learning from the other, it's sort of a give and take where the scientist is learning how to talk to journalists and get his or her message across, and we journalists are trying to convey something important to our readership that the scientist has found out. So those are so that's the first thing, is to understand what the reporter is trying to do and who the reporter is, and the fact that most of us really do want to talk to you and really want to understand this. Now, the communities of science journalists in the media, and my experience has been, before the LA Times, I was with the New York Times and so on. I mean, our community has shrunk considerably. There's a few papers that still have, science desks, but a lot of them don't. And if your paper is, in a smaller city, you're probably facing some issues there. And we can talk about that later in the Q&A about how to deal with reporters in smaller cities. But the New York Times, the LA Times, the Washington Post, they still have science desks. And so these reporters are usually versed in topics. They're usually getting alerts, and we're trying to figure out what it is that what we're going to write about. So there's a level of awareness and literacy in the topics that people maybe at a smaller city paper might not have, and that's something to consider. And then the point, the next point is that as you explain, what I found very useful with the scientists I've dealt with when we get papers is the following. First of all, I have alerts. I get stuff from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and AAAS and all of that, but sometimes it can feel like a deluge. If you work at a university and you have good PR people there, they should be reaching out to reporters who cover the particular field that you're in, whether it's, say food science or pharmaceuticals or climate science or anything like that. And they should be building those relationships and making you available. The next thing is when papers are published, there should be contact information for the lead authors and for press people there so that you're reachable. And the third thing is, once we've spoken to you, we might need to speak to you again, and a third time, and a fourth time, because we're really trying to convey, a responsible reporter is trying to convey this material in a way that is understandable to the reader, but does your work justice, right? That we're not, to be fair, like we're dumbing it down a little, but we don't want to distort anything. We don't want to leave out important nuances. so that's so that's something to be aware of. Is that you might have to explain this a bunch of times, and you might have to make yourself accessible in the evenings, on the weekends, when you're with your kids and your family and all of that. And then I guess the final thing I'd like to say is that these stories are possible because we are, like I'm showing you these articles about benzene and all of these things because the upside to having a small core group of science reporters, especially major media, is that you really do get to know us. And those of us who are here are serious about this. The people I know are really care about what they're reporting. I mean, it's a subset of the broader community, but I know mainly environmental and energy reporters. But there are people I know who cover the FDA and other issues like that, and they are they too have have a real commitment to cover what they do. When you're at a major paper, you can do a lot of things. You could be covering or whatever, but those of us who do this, we really care about this stuff. So you should be cognizant of that. And I think one other thing that I will say as a caveat going forward is that the best way to get your message across is to be that source, is to have us write about your papers, to have us interview you, tweet out your papers, all of that. I know a lot of scientists, and I've been approached by them, want to write op-eds, but I can tell you that is very, very, very hard to do. It is a lot of scientists, to be honest, don't have the skill in sort of writing things in plain English in a way that appeals to the op-ed editors. And the second thing is, and the main thing really, is that they are bombarded, the op-ed editors are bombarded with ideas and with articles that people would want to run on a particular story. So if you do want to get better, more accurate coverage of what you're working on, one of the best ways to do it is to build a relationship with a reporter and to get your articles, to get your peer-reviewed research written about. Okay, so I'll stop there and we can take questions later.
Great. Thanks, Neela, and thank you so much for being on this call. My name is Seth Michaels, and I'm the Communications Officer with the Union of Concerned Scientists. I work with our experts here and with members of the press to try and get the work that we do out into the greater world. And I'd like to talk a little bit today about how and when scientists should weigh in and engage with the public and interact with the press. So the first question is, when should you weigh in? When should you, as a scientist, as an expert, offer your input into the press or offer your input on a current issue? One of the main reasons to do it is because you have a certain kind of expertise, that the work you do is relevant to a story that is ongoing or relevant to an issue that you think is important, and that you are an expert in that area, and that's really important. Another is urgency. If you feel like this is a really important issue that's happening now, maybe there's a policy decision being made, maybe there's an event occurring that you want to help people be prepared for, that's a really good reason to think about weighing in and talking to the public and the press. If you're filling in a gap, if you feel like there's a story where maybe it's a story about a dispute between a company and activists, or between an interest group and a political organization, and all you're seeing is the debate between these two sort of interested parties, and you think that there's a role there for some hard, objective science, that's a great reason to weigh in. And finally, I would say correcting errors. If you see coverage that's bad, if you see coverage that is not necessarily bad, but just missing something, it's important to say, actually, here's what we know about this issue. Here's what we know about this, because we've all seen this. You can see the cartoon I just brought up. We've all seen those headlines that that overstate or misinterpret a scientific finding, or that take a fairly small piece of scientific finding and turn it into something very big. That's a good opportunity for you to weigh in and to share your expertise with the press. Now I'm going to talk about a couple of different ways to get involved. So I'm going to talk about opinion columns and talk about letters to the editor, and I'm going to talk about speaking to reporters, a little bit on each. The first thing I'm going to talk about is opinion columns. As Neela said, these are hard to do. They're hard to do for a few reasons, and so you have to really pick your spot for when you're going to try this, and you have to be patient and understand that the fact that you've written something does not necessarily mean it's going to get published. Opinion columns are they do take some work, and they do need to be timely, interesting, and clear. My take is that when you are thinking about writing an opinion column, it has to have a hook. You want to be responding to an event or a trend or an ongoing news story, maybe a political debate, but you want it to have some current relevance. In general, you're not going to, unless you're very high profile, you're not going to get an op-ed published on the work you do just because it's nice in the abstract. You want it to be relevant to the news cycle and relevant to what the readers of the outlet that you want to publish in are interested in. You also want it to be of kind of medium length. 500 to 750 words is often the guideline for a lot of newspapers. It's too much longer than that, and the op-ed editors are busy. They might not get through it. They might not want to have to do the work of editing it. So make sure you're going to be able to convey what you want to say at a medium length, not overly long. And we can help. At the Union of Concerned Scientists, we work with scientists sometimes out in the community, in our science network, and in the larger scientific community, to help them craft op-eds, to help them figure out what the message is. In general, I would say you don't want to put a ton of numbers and nuances and clarifications and qualifications into an op-ed. You want it to have an arc, to tell a story, and to tell a story with just a few strong points. You want to lay out a statement, support it, make your case, and then be on your way. And that's not easy to do. Before you submit your op-ed, you should show it to somebody. You should work with either us, or you should show it to a colleague or a friend, and just to get a sense of whether you're conveying the point that you want to convey. And it also helps to read things out loud to make sure that that they flow, that they make sense, that the point you want to make is coming through. So when you're writing an op-ed, it's not easy, and it's high stakes, but we're here to help, and there are opportunities when your expertise on the op-ed page can be really useful. A letter to the editor is a little bit different. A letter to the editor, you're going to want to write if it's in response to a specific news story. You'll be reading coverage of a study or an issue or a phenomenon, and maybe you want to reach out and correct one specific aspect of that story, or you want to offer a counterpoint to a theme of that story, or offer an addition. And you're going to want to do that fairly briefly. In general, letters to the editor should be in the 150 to 200 word range. That makes it an even bigger challenge, which is why you can't really write a letter to the editor in the style of an op-ed. You're not going to make a whole case. And in general, I knew this is the case for the New York Times op-ed page, and it's the case all the way down to your local paper. Letters to the editor are generally taken in response to things that are covered in the paper or in the outlet. So you're going to want to keep those very short and keep those very focused. All right, and then because I'm here in DC, we have to have jargon for everything. Back channel just means talking to reporters directly, and this is what Neela was talking about. You want to, whether it's proactive or reactive in reaction to a story that's out there, you want to be able to get yourself in contact with reporters and talk to them about the coverage they're doing. And I really want to reiterate all the stuff that Neela was saying. I think this is a really great way to make your case and to get your work out there. But you want to be, I would say the main things are, you want to be clear, you want to be polite, and you really want to meet them halfway. And I'll start with being polite. In general, reporters and editors, they want to do a good job, they want to get it right, and they appreciate people who deal with them as though they're people who want to do a good job and do it right. Let them know that you want to help, you want to offer your input, and just work with them in good faith. And it's much better to send somebody an email than to blast them on social media. You want to build that relationship as you're moving forward, and that means if you build a good relationship, if you can have a good conversation with somebody, and you're not confrontational, then they'll come back to you. They'll be interested in what you have to say and remember you for next time. I would say also clarity. You want to make a strong, clear point rather than a weak or a fuzzy one. And in order to avoid having your results or your work misinterpreted, I would say narrow down your claim to the strongest point you can defensively make, rather than having some very big idea that if you're not clear about it could get misinterpreted. If you have information that's detailed or technical that could correct a story that you've seen or inform a reporter as to the things they cover, that sort of back channel phone or email conversation is a great way to do that. You'll really be able to help them understand, and again, I would say just make sure to meet them halfway. As Neela said, reporters are generally not scientists. Neither are most of their readers. So they think about things in a very different way than you. They'll think about what is a strong and clear message I can convey, rather than the sort of hedging and uncertainty that often comes in scientific writing. And obviously you don't want to be saying things that are not the results of your actual work, not the expertise you have, but you want to make sure that you are conveying it in a way that if a lay reader reading this in the newspaper, reading your quotes in the newspaper, that they'll understand it. And think about how you would talk about your work with a friend who's not a scientist. And as you are thinking about what to say to a reporter, just make sure you are putting yourself in their shoes and thinking about it in that context. And in case you get the chance to speak on the record to reporters, and in general, if you are talking on the phone to a reporter or talking in person or via email to a reporter, and they're interviewing you, they're asking you questions, you're on the record unless you're told specifically otherwise. So I just have a few tips and pointers for that. I would say speak slowly and clearly, especially if you're on the phone. If people are often recording, but if they're writing notes, if they really want to understand what you're saying, they'll want to hear it slowly and clearly what your points are, especially if it's technical and complicated. Prep first. Don't wing it. And that does not mean knowing the gist of what you want to say in your head. It means actually taking some notes, writing things down, having a sense of what you want to say, and maybe saying it out loud to yourself or saying it out loud to a friend before you do it. I advise you not to just talk cold to people. but rather to, if you get a call and somebody's asking you to weigh in on a story or talk about your research, I would say, okay, what are some of your questions? Can you give me a chance to call you back and take a little prep time? As we were talking about, for the lay audience, avoid jargon and acronyms. And as much as possible, I like to use analogies. I think analogies are really helpful to help people understand what you're saying, as long as you don't get hung up on the analogy. And finally, stay in your lane, which means don't try to go too far afield. As a scientist, and as a scientist who is also a source for a reporter, your credibility is really important. And that means you should stick to the area of your expertise. You shouldn't go too far afield. If you get questions that you don't quite understand or you don't quite have a good answer to, you're free to say, I don't necessarily have a good answer to that, or that's outside of your expertise, outside of the scope of your work. You don't have to have an answer to everything that you get asked. And you want to be able to make the strongest, most credible case you can, and you can do that by answering the questions you're most qualified to answer. And that's some of my best practices and tips for working with reporters. I really appreciate everything that Neela said. I think she's got great advice there, and I think we can ready to open up for questions.
Great, thank you, Neela and Seth. Yeah, we're ready to dive into questions, so go ahead and send those in through the chat function on your screen. We're already getting some in. Just type them out, and we'll get to as many as possible. So the first question I would like to direct to Neela is, we were sent this in beforehand. What's the best way to interact with reporters on Twitter or on social media generally?
Well, obviously, if you like something, it's to retweet it and say something nice, as you will with anybody. So that's probably not the hard part. The hard part is when somebody gets something wrong, and how do you interact with people? And I think restraint is always a good rule of thumb, and I say that as a journalist too, who sees stuff all the time that I think is ridiculous. What Seth said is really crucial, and I've run into this in my career too, that if I've had errors in my story, people haven't dissed me on Twitter, they've just emailed me, and almost all reporters have an email address linked to their story, or it's not that hard to find. You can just go to Google and try to find somebody's email address, and you just email them and say, well, in fact, this particular fact was incorrect, or that, and it's actually a pretty good litmus test, because the reporter who comes back and says, oh, I'm so sorry, I'll correct that, is a reporter that you'll want to work with, because they have integrity about their work, they're not getting their back up. Now, the reporters who don't, are probably not that reliable, and you want to keep an eye on them, but they may not be the best people to go to with your work. But that said, calling somebody out on Twitter, even somebody who you think is, I've seen this happen, not so much with science reporters, but I've seen it happen recently with a New York Times campaign finance reporter, that people just get really defensive because it's a public forum, and so you have to be cognizant of that. So that's, so I would avoid getting into a Twitter war. If this is a person who's at media that is not agenda driven, right? That's not an advocacy group or something like that. And even then, I would try to go through email first. If they're resistant, and if you really think they're wrong and they haven't responded or made a correction, then you should go to the editor of that reporter. And again, you can find that on the masthead and so on. And CC the reporter, in when you write to the editor and say, look, I've gotten no response, and this is incorrect, and you're giving this impression, this erroneous impression. So that's what I would do. I would really avoid, a street fight on Twitter.
Great. Seth, did you want to weigh in, or should I take the next question?
I agree with everything Neela says. I also think that, with social media, following people who write about your subject area is really important. It helps you understand what kind of stories are being written about your work. It helps you understand, who are the people who cover it, who are the people who pay attention to it. I find Twitter a really useful tool for following press coverage.
And I'd like to add one more thing too, and I see the questions are starting to pile up, and we'll definitely get to them. And that is that, you as a scientist, I don't know what your institution's policies are, but, you should also feel free to tweet your impressions of things, right? I remember getting, enormous, I remember sort of getting a lot of followers when I was live tweeting I think it was a House Science Committee hearing on climate change. And, I can't editorialize too much because I'm a reporter. I'm not an op-ed writer. But scientists can fact check that stuff. And, and if you're, again, you don't want to get too snarky. You want to be careful. But people, if you're doing something regularly, it's conversational. People are following, you'll be surprised how many people will be like, well, who is this, Jane Smith? And they'll look you up and they'll say, oh, she's an astrophysicist or a climatologist, and I will, I'll follow this person and I'll consider her a resource in the future when I have to write about X. So, so that's a way that you could use Twitter that doesn't really have to do with us, but lets you, without the medium of a journalist, directly engage with a wider audience and at the same time get followers, including journalists.
Great. I'm going to take the next question from Stephen. I think this is in regard to some of the examples that Neela was sharing in the beginning. He writes, I'm concerned that when reporters report a story about fracking-induced contamination of drinking water, for example, the average reader would just think that fracking is bad. So do reporters feel any responsibility for educating the reader about the broader context and more nuanced parts of big issues like fracking? Neela, do you want to take that?
The short answer is yes. And if you were to read my stories or the stories of my peers, you would, I think you would definitely pick that up. There's a, I feel like that there's an assumption inherent in that question that we don't do that. And the reason, I picked those articles is not because they're advocacy, but because they're, those articles were published in top-flight peer-reviewed journals, Science, Nature, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And they help get to the heart of what's going on. And let's talk a little bit about water and being a reporter and understanding and having relationships with scientists and where that gets you, okay? Because I had a good relationship with Rob Jackson, 2 years ago, EPA shut down its third inquiry into possible water contamination because of natural gas or oil development that it had launched at the behest of citizens. One was in Dimmock, Pennsylvania, one was in Parker County, Texas, and the third was in Pavilion, Wyoming. And Pavilion was the one that got shut down. And I remember talking to Rob, and I said, is this just a coincidence, or is there something going on here? He's like, well, I've been talking to scientists, field scientists for just sort of rank and file EPA people, and they don't know what's going on either. They think we should be keeping on top of this. So already I'm going to a scientist and seeing, is this just a coincidence, or is there something going on here? And he, in turn, is plugged in with his colleagues in government, and he's telling me, yes, you should keep an eye on this. So based on that, we actually got information from somebody inside EPA about what happened in Dimmock, Pennsylvania, that in fact scientists there wanted to continue monitoring the water quality in this little town, and EPA out of DC shut it down. That made enormous waves, and it was based not just on hearsay or some masked man that I met in a garage or something, but it was based on a report, an internal scientific report based on water samples that was given to me because I expressed interest in it. And again, I showed it to people who I know are specialists, to scientists who are specialists in water quality and hydraulic fracturing, and they interpreted it for me. And that's so that helped. Finally, I focused on what EPA was doing with its water study. EPA, I guess, it must have been 4 or 5 years ago, said that they would weigh in on the whole water and fracking issue by doing this comprehensive study. And so people saw them as the arbiter of this issue. And what scientists had told me was that there were a lot of interesting things that EPA was looking at, but that basically EPA needed to do prospective studies, looking at water quality in a particular area before any oil and gas development began, during the drilling, during fracking, and during production, to see if water quality changed, right? I mean, that's the way you would determine if anything's going on. And that oil and gas companies had stymied this. So I wrote that story in spring of last year, right? And so, so then EPA comes out with this water study. Sure enough, doesn't have any of that. And what EPA does is that it says there's no widespread contamination of water by fracking. There's nothing systemic. But there have been instances of fracking, there have been isolated instances of fracking, of contaminated water by fracking. Right. So the fact that EPA said that there was nothing systemic. Because I've been on this issue, I realized this was the first time ever that the EPA had said that water had been contaminated by fracking. Before this, they said they'd never heard of this instance. And I wrote that story. That story was an outlier. But, it got a lot of traffic. That's fine. What happens later? Well, just now the Science Advisory Board at EPA has been telling EPA, I mean, they're going to come out with their final report this spring, but basically the scientists, so it's not, journalists like me, but scientists told EPA, you have not given the evidence to make that kind of sweeping statement that there is not widespread systemic contamination of water by fracking. So what that shows is that my relationships with scientists, my expertise in this, helped me to understand what that report was really saying. And I feel vindicated that the scientists themselves said it. So, do I add context? Yes. And do I actually have a leg to stand on this issue? I do, because I talk to the people who understand this stuff.
Thank you so much, Neela. That was great, really informative. Just going to switch gears a little bit here. We've been getting some questions in about people who are interested in either transitioning to or starting a career in science communication or science journalism. Seth or Neela, do you have any advice on how to get started?
I mean, I could take this again too, because so at Inside Climate we have several people who, like one of my colleagues, Lisa Song, who won a Pulitzer for her work on the Enbridge spill. Who worked with me on the Exxon project more recently, she's a graduate of MIT in environmental sciences. Zara Hirji, also, she was in a graduate program at MIT. There are more and more programs now for science communications and science writing, and I would urge you to look into those programs. People are definitely interested in hiring hiring applicants who have that real grounding in science that a humanities major like me doesn't, but who can write clearly and lucidly for the lay audience. So I would definitely encourage it. And just because science desks at papers are shrinking doesn't mean that there isn't new life for science reporting elsewhere. Inside Climate News, where I work, is a prime example of that. ProPublica has been doing a lot of work on fracking and healthcare and all sorts of issues. Even places like BuzzFeed and Gawker are looking at more serious journalism. So you can find a home during science journalism. It just may not be the New York Times.
One other thing I'd add to that is that writing is very much a muscle, and it takes practice and exercise to build it up. So I think that writing, if you were going to try writing op-eds or try writing letters to the editor, or even trying to write, for instance, your own blog, these are great ways to get some practice writing and writing about science for a lay audience. The ability to translate science for a lay audience is a pretty impressive skill, and that I think is the skill to develop. And I would echo what Neela said about the online outlets that are offering more venues for science writing.
Great, thanks for that. We have another question here. How can scientists best present information to reporters? Write it out on paper, stress important points vocally. Seth, I know you talked a little bit about the best way to do an in-person interview or over the phone. Do you mind diving a little more deeply into that, and then maybe Neela can talk about ways that she prefers to receive information?
Sure thing. One of the things that I think reporters think about, and that you should be thinking about as you're trying to get attention for your work is what we call the news hook. What about your work is new? Is there a finding that that hasn't appeared anywhere before? Is there a finding that runs counter to some conventional wisdom, or is there a finding that raises the prominence of a political issue, or if it raises the prominence of an industry? So I always would say when you're looking to present your information to reporters, think for yourself ahead of time about what the news hook is. That's a really that really will be the difference between getting your email or your phone call answered or not. Is if you have a strong, interesting hook for your news. Again, that's something that we work on here at UCS. When we're working with our experts, we do messaging. We figure out what's the message we want the reader to come away with. What are a couple of key facts that really illustrate that message? So the more you can boil it down, whether you're having an in-person interview or a phone interview, or whether you're sending an email, or writing up a one-pager to give some background on a larger paper you did. Just look for what are the couple of sentences that you would like your reader or the reader of a news story about your work to know, and then find the couple of really strong key facts that support that, and always look for what the news hook is.
And what I would add, to what Seth said is that there are actually things that you or like I said, if you're a university and you have press people there who can help you with it, or a department, there's press people there. There are a few things that you can do to make sure that, say, a paper that you've done is covered properly by the journalist. First of all, find out which journalists actually cover this stuff. I mean, you'd be surprised, like, how many things I get from people who it's clear, like, they've never read what I've done. And this is usually from the PR people. But when you get something that you know is tailored for you because they've read your work on climate change or fracking, then you respond to it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, if something is embargoed for release, give the reporter enough time. I mean, 5 days, a week, something to digest that. Because you have to understand that reporters are working on other things too. It's not going to be just your paper that they're trying to figure out. And thirdly, do not give an exclusive to somebody like the New York Times, like some really high-profile publication, and then when they write the story, Justin Gillis writes the story at the New York Times, expect the rest of us to cover it too. If you're going to issue something that's this on an embargoed basis and you think it has nationwide or international import, then make it a level playing field. Because if you really want to tick off a reporter, make him or her feel second best, right? That's the way to do it. So and I've been on both ends of that. I've been at the New York Times and gotten things exclusively, and I've been elsewhere, like at the LA Times, and have not. And so those are good ways too. And then as far as and when you make yourself available because of your paper, you can you can talk to people. Obviously, like to answer this is this question from Sarah. Yes, I mean talk to people. if you're making a correction, like I said, send an email, but then, say, I'd be happy to talk to you by phone and explain it to you further, and so, all of those avenues are useful.
Great. Thank you very much for that. Sounds like it's a lot of building relationship advice, which is always very helpful. Next question, how can reporters and scientists address the media's desire to cover, quote unquote, both sides of an issue as if they're on equal footing? And this is something that bothers me as a reader as well sometimes. Neela, would you like to try answering that?
Sure. I found that on climate change, I don't really know anybody who's doing that anymore. Now, the rest of you, I realize it's not just climate scientists on this call, so I'm not as aware of, say, what's going on in other fields as such. But, there was a time when people, climate deniers were quoted as if they were just as legitimate as climate scientists. That doesn't happen anymore in major media. But I think, I think this really is about building relationships with reporters, going to the editors, building relationships with them and the newspapers, and really sort of pushing to clarify and to educate. It's a long haul, and climate, climate is a great example of this. It took a really long time before mainstream media started to do this false equivalency between legitimate climate scientists and usually interests, backed by, or so-called experts backed by political or corporate interests who would deny climate change.
Seth, did you have anything to add?
Sure, and I actually think this relates to the earlier question on tracking. I mean, every issue that is of political import there's an element of tragedy to it, because there are different interests on any side of an issue. There are disagreements of opinion, but what your role is as a scientist, and this is, I think, how you can be helpful to journalists who are covering these stories, is to say, this is not, advocacy. Is to limit the extent to which you're doing, advocacy for a political position, and really stick to the science to say, look, here's what the research shows. My job as a scientist is to follow my observations and this data and the experiments, the scientific process to whatever the outcome is, and this is what my research shows. And the more you can convey that clearly and credibly, I think that is going to be a really strong tool to prevent a story from turning into, well, one industry says this and the other industry says that, so throw up your hands, shruggy. Being able to make that strong, clear case about what your scientific research shows, what the scientific process has come up with, is a really good way to make sure that the real story is being told.
It's a great example of bringing it back to your own research and talking about, what you know best. So I think we have time for one last question. This question I think I'm going to direct first to you, Seth. It's more of a science communication question, and I think maybe you can talk about some of the ways that you've dealt with this with our own scientists and analysts here at UCS. How can you convey the seriousness of risk without sounding absurdly alarmist?
That is a very good question, and it's a challenge in the science journalism world to be able to say, here's what the data shows, here's the trajectory we're on, without seeming either like you're a crazy person with your hair on fire or that you're counseling despair. So what I like to think that the right way to approach this is to just be really systematic about it, to walk to walk the journalist you're talking to, or to walk the reader of your op-ed, take them step by step through the process. Okay, so here's the physical process at work. Here's the effect it has in this experiment. Here's what it looks like on a bigger scale. If you do that dispassionately and you can convey that, by the time you get to the end and you've walked them through that process, then you can get to and here's why that's really serious. But I think that establishing your credibility by laying out your scientific argument step by step is really important before you get into the kind of advocacy or the passion part of it, right? It's a challenge, and that's why I always recommend you don't just go into these things cold. You have somebody else look at the things you're writing, or you talk through what you want to say to the reporter with somebody else. When the process goes right from your head to the paper or the phone call or the email, then you don't get that check from another person saying, okay, but what does this actually mean? So I think that's a really good way to tone down sounding alarmist but still convey your point.
Great. Well, before we wrap up, I wanted to give each of our speakers just a few seconds to share any parting thoughts or final tips that they wanted to leave with you. Neela, any last thoughts?
Sure. I think the struggle that scientists face to get their message across and to have people understand the reality, the data and evidence show is huge in our society these days, because there have been various forces in our society that have politicized everything. I mean, I grew up in the Deep South. Nobody questioned when I was a kid that evolution was taught in school, and now people question it, and it's a sign to me of the difficulties that scientists face in getting accurate coverage of the phenomena that you research. That said, there has been success in assuring greater accuracy in reporting, and I think climate is one of those spaces. Just like I mentioned, people really don't talk to deniers unless it's an agenda-driven media outlet like, say, Fox News or Daily Caller or someplace like that. They really are marginalized. And one of the reasons, I think, is because climate scientists have spoken up more, and they've also done things like created this, I don't know how many of you are aware of it, this entity called it's called the Climate Science Rapid Response Team. So that, if I, as a reporter, have questions about something, I can go submit my question, and they'll find a scientist who can walk me through it and explain things to me. So that's very useful. And I'll just go back to the original point. I mean, we need you, and we will turn to you, and hopefully you'll find a way to talk to us so that you get your point across in the ways that need to be expressed.
Great. Thank you for that, and thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today. Seth, did you have any final remarks?
Just everything Neela said, and also just make sure whenever you're communicating with people who are in the press or in the general public, that not everybody has a science background, so put yourself in the shoes of a layperson and think about it from their perspective.
That is a great takeaway to end with. But before you leave, I did want to raise an opportunity with you that if you would like to practice your communication skills, your writing skills, if you're thinking about writing an op-ed, you could always test out your ideas by writing a guest blog for The Equation, which is UCS's blog. because blogs, like op-eds, should be short and to the point while conveying a sense of personality but also urgency. So to test out your skills and write a guest blog for us, leave a comment in the survey after the webinar and we'll follow up with you. And I'll also be following up with you after this webinar to share some of the resources that we mentioned and a copy of the recording so you can rewatch and catch what you missed or pass it along to colleagues. And with that, I would like to thank you so much for joining us. Thank you once again to Neela and Seth for taking the time to impart some of their wisdom to us. And I look forward to seeing all of you on the next webinar. Thanks. Have a great day.